for people who are wealthy, once you're wealthy, you don't need to be twice as rich. You just never want to be half as rich.
Welcome to The Art of Quality, the podcast seeking wisdom in business, investing, systems, and the art of paying attention. Each episode uncovers rare stories from practitioners who have spent years pursuing multi-generational excellence in their craft. We are seeking to understand how the world really works and how we can align our actions to it. I am your host, John Candito, and this is our series on the art of quality in investing.
John Candito is the founder and managing partner of the Phronesis Fund, the lead sponsor of the series. This podcast is for informational purposes only and is not investment advice. The podcast host, guests, and clients of the Phronesis Fund may maintain positions in securities that are discussed.
Chris Poch is the founder of Promethium Advisors, which advises families of size and complexity and manages wealth with a focus on family harmony and after-tax compounded results. Promethium is the culmination of Chris's 40 years of investment management experience and 25 years of planning. In this episode, we discuss why you never have to apologize for owning quality, why people overweight easily observed data, the sacred art of listening, and much more. Those wishing to go deeper should look forward to Chris's forthcoming book titled Money and Meaning: What I've Learned from Advising the Very Wealthy. Please enjoy our conversation with Chris Poch. Alrighty, Chris, welcome to The Art of Quality.
Well, John, thank you very much. I'm excited to be here.
Absolutely. There's so much I'm excited to get into. You and I have spoken widely and deeply over the little bit of time we've known each other on quality, on time, on how do you know what you know. So I'm excited to get into all of that. One of the things that I've loved learning is you recently launched your own firm, and you say it was the culmination of 40 years of experience and 25 years of planning. 25 years is a lot. So can you tell us the story?
Yeah, John, thanks for asking. So I've been in the business a little bit over 40 years. And for the first, let's say 15 plus, I worked as an investment advisor working with regular clients and then institutional clients and doing consulting. And then towards the end of that, I started working with wealthy individuals and decided that I wanted to bring my thoughts beyond just my practice in Washington, D.C. to the firm. So I pitched the idea of putting together a wealth management initiative at Smith Barney, Citigroup, to my bosses, and they agreed. They asked me to come up, build it, and run it. And so that was in roughly 2000 when I left my practice in the D.C. area. And I went up from a yellow legal pad with a couple ideas and put it together. I had terrific support. We did really well. And so from 25 years ago, from the early 2000s, I've been honing wealth management, private wealth management, and how it all works together. And over the course of time, it's had several different iterations. Things evolve and life changes. And what I did find is that what I wanted to do often was something I felt that was needed or desired by clients, but not available in the way the firm wanted to deliver it, at least at that time. And so a little over a year ago, I decided instead of complaining about things, I'd go out and open my own firm, do it the way I think clients really want it, and the way I want it for my family and my friends. And that is where we are today at Promethium Advisors.
That's wonderful. One of the things you and I have talked about is You've always been a little bit of a pain to your bosses because you wanted to do things differently. And one of the through lines in that is, and something I deeply respect about you, is you have evolved a lot. And I think the common human experience is to sort of get good at something and then just sort of, be good at that through your career and kind of sit there and not move much. And you've moved a lot, you've evolved a lot, and over a long period of time. So how have you maintained the plasticity, the willingness, the ability to keep, not just sit still, to keep evolving?
Well, I think Darwin told us that there's bad consequences if we don't do that. But I think really, if you're interested in people and life and you like what you do, you realize that there is almost always another way that might be a little different, might be a little bit better. And as technology evolves, the marketplace evolves, the client needs evolves, the laws change, the products, all those sorts of things make the next opportunity more exciting than the current opportunity. And I think, I'm lucky. I really enjoy what I do. And I get up every day excited because I look forward to going in, doing the things that I do for the clients who I like, work with the people that make me happy. And generally, things work out really well. So as far as evolving goes, I think you need to. And I must say that we probably both know people who can't wait to retire, at age 60 or 62 or 65. And it's generally because they hate their job or they hate what they do. And I've really not had that. I've had times where I've been unhappy with how things are going, but that's up to me to change either my circumstances or my attitude. So I think it's an opportunity for all of us to evolve if we choose to. And, when we're evolving to something we think provides a better service for more people, doing a better job, I think it makes everybody happy.
I love it. I very much agree. So one of the things we jammed on early, and a line that I have some of these lines we're going to talk about, which I sort of mentally think of as Chris Poch lines. And one of them is that you never have to apologize for owning quality. And of course, on this podcast, we kind of pursue capital Q quality in many different vectors. And so that was a little bit of a bat signal to me, and also something I've learned a lot from you on. So can you break that out for us a little bit? I mean, what do you mean when you say you never have to apologize for owning quality?
Well, I guess it evolves from when I had to apologize for not owning quality, and oftentimes those recommendations or investment decisions were either poor or a disaster. Of course, it's a ripoff of the 1970 love story phrase, Ally McGraw to Ryan O'Neal, who said, love means never having to say you're sorry. And if you love your clients and you want them to do well and you want them to stay clients, but more importantly, to do well, I think if you err to the side of quality in your investment recommendations, in the way in which you service them, in the way in which you treat them, things generally go well. But specifically as it relates to quality, we have a bias from an investment perspective to tend to look for financially strong companies, but it's really more, we want to have positions where if things don't go right, if you buy, let's just say something, like a major soda company, for example, that's been around forever, people know the brand, it's financially strong, generally does well with global sales. It may not be that exciting, but it's not going to have an air pocket where it drops 50% or something like that. So when you have a portfolio full of companies that generally represent quality in one form or another, they may not outperform an index every quarter, every year. Sometimes they'll trail it just because the growth prospects are not that exciting. But generally, people are pretty happy that they own it because they know that they're not going to go broke owning some of these great franchises.
Makes sense. One maybe criticism of the idea of let's just own quality is if it were easy, everyone would do it, and you wouldn't have any bad businesses to invest in. And so one of the things we've learned on in this investigation through this podcast and other places is there's a lot to understand about quality that is, let's just say in between things. It's not as simple as a stock screen. It's not as simple as, we found the next great manager and now it's easy. And so I wonder, as you've gone through your evolution in learning about and understanding quality, what are some of the things you've had to unlearn, or maybe traps where this looked like quality but it wasn't, or how have you kind of evolved in your understanding of what that looks like?
John, it's a really good question. And I think the most important thing to understand is there are many ways to define quality. And if you think about going back to the days of the great consumer companies that have done really well, regardless of what the name is, they have these franchises that are enduring and people like them and they go back and they're loyal and the balance sheets are attractive and the free cash flow rises pretty much every year, stock goes up, et cetera. Those are quality organizations. And then if you think about the last 5 or 6, 7, 8 years, maybe longer, the definition of quality sort of evolved to some of these major technology companies that had great balance sheets because they had tons of cash, not very much debt, what looked like limitless upside. And then you got to a point of at what price. And so I think what I've learned over time is that you have to be open-minded enough to understand that there can be an evolving definition of quality and both being true. The mistakes that I've made in the past is I've been locked into a paradigm that shifted and I didn't realize it. And I felt comfortable in my old definition because it worked in the past. And I had all kinds of studies and what have you to rely on when I was wrong from an investment perspective. So the important thing is understanding that these definitions do evolve and they can be applied differently in different industries and different companies during different timeframes.
Yeah, one of the things that I think we probably all just makes this game hard is all of the studies are by definition backward looking. And there's nothing good or bad about that. I very often think of this line by Voltaire that history never repeats, but man always does. And I try to find the wisdom in there. I mean, it's obviously, there are signs of a business being bad and heading a bad direction. There are signs of a business being stable, being resilient, et cetera. So it's not, I think we learn a lot from studies on, what not to do or what danger looks like. Of course, our job is to navigate the world in front of us. And so I wonder, maybe if you could talk a little bit about the interplay between the wisdom you get from looking backwards and saying, what have we learned about how, what a good business looks like, what good managers look like, that kind of thing, versus what do we have to just figure out from first principles since we're looking at an unfolding world in front of us?
The whole idea about, history doesn't repeat, it rhymes or man repeats. I think the human behavior element of investing is really well understood now. And the biases that we bring into whatever situation or environment is really interesting. And if you're unaware that you bring a biases in, you're really going to be in trouble. You're going to make a mistake and maybe a big one. But if you're at least aware of some of the biases that you bring into the equation, then you have a reasonable probability of being able to navigate it. I think about some of these studies that have been done, and I rely heavily on studies and I rely on patterns and things that have worked in the past, but trying to understand why they worked in the past in the time frame that they worked. And then as importantly as understanding that is understanding the time frame that preceded it, which caused them to work. So as you said, this is not easy and it's not simple, but I do rely on a lot of studies. I quote studies often, and I base decisions on things that have happened in the past. I'll give you one example. There's an evolving discussion or debate as to how much diversification is the right amount. And you have people that will say, thousands of, securities are optimal and, that perhaps that can be true. But to me, what was really interesting, there was a study in the late 60s done on the optimal number, the minimum number of stocks in a portfolio where you would have, experiencing diminishing utility out of having an additional stock. And they used the New York Stock Exchange as the universe to do this original study. Well, to get on the New York Stock Exchange, you had a minimum level of quality. It wasn't not easy. It was expensive. You had to have a good balance sheet. You had to have, credit rating, all these kinds of things that put you on the New York Stock Exchange. And they found, somewhere between 15 and 20 stocks were the right amount for diversification. And then you go out to the next study that was done by some PhD. And of course, they need to get the PhD, the doctorate, so they had to create a different study. And so they lowered the threshold of quality. And what you find is that the lower the quality, let's just say balance sheet stability, if we're going to use some metric, the lower that bar goes, the greater the number is required in order to have appropriate diversification. So if you keep lowering the bar, you need to spread it out and spread it out and spread it out because so much of this stuff is not high quality and you're going to have a lot of zeros and bankruptcies. So understanding what the studies are and where they are, allows someone like Stan Druckenmiller to say, well, I have about 6 positions on at any given time, and I might change my mind in 15 minutes. And then, Warren Buffett, he's got 77, 78, operating companies that they own outright. And then they've got a portfolio of whatever there is, like 15 or 20 core and a lot of small little pieces. So their diversification is different. And then you've got Charlie Munger, who used to say he's got 3 positions. He's got, Berkshire, he's got that hedge fund run by Leilu in China, and then you've got Costco. And so the studies, I think, are critical to know, to be able to refer to, but it's really important that you understand, that we understand that when that study was done, the situation was very different than today, and understanding how to apply the conclusions of the study to today's environment is what makes for a good portfolio manager.
Absolutely. One of the things that sticks out to me is as you talk through that is the higher the quality bar, let's say, it actually increases one's ability to focus. If you're going to have a low quality bar, you need to understand maybe 50 companies to invest in. If you have a high quality bar, maybe you can do 20, 10, 4. And if we think through what does quality in terms of process and attention and diligence look like, I've always thought it's really hard to know 100 companies really well.
It's impossible. It's delusional. Exactly. No one knows 100 companies really well.
Yes. And so this seems an obvious way we can make a very difficult game a little bit easier, is just say if we have a very high bar, now we can focus more intensely on a handful of things. Related to that, and another one of these things I associate as in my mind, these are soundtracks of Chris Poch wisdom, is you often say people overvalue easily observed data. Could you talk a little bit about that? I think there's so much wisdom in there.
Well, all these bits of wisdom that I've accumulated, I invariably stole from somebody else, or I learned them on my own because I did it the opposite way. But I could say as a young investment professional, when you don't know very much, you really rely on data, and you have to cite some other expert or whatever it is. And I would try to do my homework. I'd do the best job I could with the education, the information, the experience that I have. But I would really always want to have some sort of fact pattern that when I was wrong, I could kind of blame somebody else. So I didn't want to, take on the heat myself. And over time, I realized that it is essential to know the data, and you don't need to know all the data, but you need to know what the data says. But then with some time and experience and wisdom and scar tissue and mistakes, you can start at that point as opposed to end at that point. And I think it's the great investors who do things that it's hard to explain to others, and then they end up being right. I mean, if they were wrong, we wouldn't know about them. You think about, Steve Jobs and how he basically said, customers don't know what they want until I make it, show it to them, and then they love it. And Amazon, Jeff Bezos, was famous by saying, we knew how much incremental business we would get by offering free shipping, but it was never enough to make up for the lost revenue. But despite that, we couldn't measure the value of incremental customer loyalty and purchasing habits easily, but I just felt it was the right thing to do, so we did it. And I've come to appreciate that, particularly with a lot of these technology stocks, but great consumer companies who have tremendously high price-to-earnings ratios. And the people who buy them, whether it's, a video streaming service or electric car, whatever, I can say quantitatively I was right not to owe them, but, my clients suffered. And so will my grandchildren because I didn't own them. So I over-relied on easily observed data to justify not buying them, and then ended up being wrong. So as I evolve as a portfolio manager today, and an investor and an advisor, whatever, I try to listen for the dog that didn't bark. I try to understand deeply why there is a belief system that some company is worth a lot more than what would normally be the valuation metric. And I don't dismiss it for being wrong. I don't dismiss it saying, a billion people aren't as smart as me. I deeply try to understand it. Don't always arrive at the same conclusion, but I think that that's really a key element in being a good investor, because sometimes you just have to buy something because you think it's going to do well over the next decade, and then you have to have the patience to let it happen.
Yeah, I'll bring in another Chris Poch quote that I think often of, that there are things you just know. And my partners and I, with this, art of quality investigation, we often talk about roots to knowledge and thinking with the whole body and trying to see what wisdom we can get from intuition, or what wisdom is there beyond our ability to express it in words. And of course, all of these things are difficult, but that language of things you just know, I think, is poking at a little bit of that, where this is far from guessing. This is actually using maybe a route to truth that is a little bit broader than just something we can write in a paragraph. So can you talk a little bit about that? Because I know you're a disciplined person, so this is far more than just a hunch. But so how do you get to things you just know?
That's a really hard question. It's a good question. I was pondering this, and it just popped in my mind. One of the great representations of quality throughout time as it relates to, let's say, coaching, mentorship, teaching, was the famous UCLA basketball coach John Wooden. And, uniquely, he was All-American as a player as well as a coach. And his entire mantra was all about quality, about doing the right things, about doing the fundamentals correctly. And success wasn't, achieving the national championship, although I think they did win it 11 times. Success was, the journey, it's the road. But the things that you just know, he had principles that were good for the team and appropriate for the times. And he stood by his principles, and people respected him for that. There's sort of a famous story where, Bill Walton, I think they had won the national championship. Maybe he's coming in as a senior, I'm not sure. But he was sort of a little bit of a protester, if not a radical. And there was a rule that you couldn't have facial hair on UCLA. And Bill shows up first day of practice, and he's got this full beard, and he's this sort of hippie guy, whatever. And he goes up to the coach, and he says, coach says, you can't play with a beard. And Bill says, it's my right, I can do whatever I want, and I'm going to wear a beard. And John Wooden just says, you know what, Bill, you're right. You do have the right to have a beard. The team's going to miss you this year. And Bill Walton figured out in a nanosecond that John Wooden was going to stay with his principles, and he ran down, he got a haircut and shave, and he came back and he practiced, and they won the championship. But this thing about you just know, there's certain things that you just know because you've been around them for so long, and you understand that in the circumstances, there's things that need to be done. As it relates to investing, George Soros wrote a book called The Alchemy of Finance. I think it was 1985, 86, maybe 87, I think. And he would talk about, he knew that there was something bad going to happen when he had a pain in his back, right?
Yeah.
And he wrote this over the course of 3 years, and his trading got better, but then he would talk about these intangibles, and he couldn't pin it down. And what I would say to the investor is, if you ever are uncomfortable with something, just go to cash. It's for people who are wealthy. Once you're wealthy, you don't need to be twice as rich. You just never want to be half as rich. And if you're ever invested in something or involved in anything that makes you lose sleep at night, feel like you might lose your reputation, put others at risk, yourself or your finances or your family or whatever, then just don't do it. So I think as far as just knowing things has to do a lot with experience. And maybe this is because I've been doing this for 40 years and I have an opinion, but I don't think you should ignore that. I think you should weigh it. And if you feel strongly about it, do whatever your body or your back or your mind is telling you.
Mm-hmm. I love that. It's definitely poking at, let's say, a form of wisdom or intelligence that gets beyond the limits of our language. It's funny and maybe a little bit odd that, there's so much of, the world doesn't really seem to question grandma's wisdom or a mother's intuition so much. But for whatever reason in investing, I think the world often questions an argument that doesn't fit neatly into a paragraph expressed in a language. And I think it's fairly clear there's more than that. That's a very limiting form of epistemology. It's a good one, but it's not the only one. And so you put that beautifully. I also love that line of yours. If you're wealthy, you don't need to be twice as rich, but you don't want to be half as rich. And that I think that compresses a lot of wisdom and just that philosophy. And I've heard you say it a lot. Can you riff on that a little bit? I mean, how did you even get to that nice phrase? And then, what does that mean to you and what do you do about it?
So, Carnegie said, if you want to make money, put all your eggs in one basket and then you watch it. And then his partner, Henry Phipps, basically said, let's diversify it. The idea is that, we work hard in whatever business or profession that we have, or maybe we're fortunate enough to be part of a family that's had success in generations prior. And a certain amount of assets have been accumulated, which will support you and your family and hopefully, the local community, if not society at large. And then the question is, how much more do you need? And for most people, the answer is not a whole lot more. For most people, there are some people that are just insatiable that the number has to be bigger. And I think that's a sad situation. There's some people who want to do more and do better because it's good not only for them, but it's good for others because they're producing a valuable service or goods. And, you might put Elon Musk in there with not only Tesla, but SpaceX and the board and the brain thing and all the other stuff he has going on. He's got an enormous ego and he's sort of an exaggerator, but no one can doubt what he is doing is benefiting mankind. But once you have enough, whatever that is, the question is, how much more do you need to have? And the answer for most people is, I don't need to have a whole lot more. And it's much more important to me that I'm able to sustain my standard of living, after inflation, taxes, and fees without taking a whole lot of risk. And so what we try to do is for ourselves and our clients is help them sort of put a framework around whatever that sentiment is. And that could be, in dollars and cents, that could be expected volatility, that could be income streams. But what we want people to do is feel like they are on the path towards peace of mind. So it's my premise that the ultimate goal of life is to have peace of mind. That's why we're here. That's where we're going. And financial independence is a step or a stop on that road towards peace of mind. And so what we want to do is make people feel confident that they have financial independence or on the path to financial independence, so they don't have to worry about that, so they can get to peace of mind. So, part of this is once you have a certain amount of money, more is just more, it's not better. And then if you exceed a certain threshold, you go from a wealthy private individual that some people know have means and assets to a public figure who's a target for criticism, for lawsuits, for, all sorts of slip and fall and and spurious things. So we just try to help people get their arms around whatever that means to them and then put them on the path of confidence they're going to get what they need.
I love that. That's beautiful. I think it's just criminally under-discussed, the problems that come with gaining beyond a certain level of wealth. And it's, more always sounds better. I think often of, there's a poem that Kurt Vonnegut published when Joseph Heller, who wrote Catch-22, passed away. And I'm just going to read it real quick. It's very short, but I think often of it. So the poem is True Story, Word of Honor. Joseph Heller, an important and funny writer, now dead, and I were at a party given by a billionaire on Shelter Island. I said, Joe, how does it make you feel to know that our host only yesterday may have made more money than your novel Catch-22 earned in its entire history? And Joe said, I've got something he can never have. And I said, what on earth could that be, Joe? And Joe said, the knowledge that I've got enough. Not bad, rest in peace.
Right.
And there's so much wisdom in that.
I love that story. It's knowing when you have enough is it's a really good place to be.
Mm-hmm. Very much. And that kind of gets at, so you're, I think at the tail end of writing, or you finished writing a book that will come out here soon. And so tell us the title. And I mean, I'd love to, I know it's poking at a lot of what we're at here. So tell us the title and kind of why the world needed a book like this.
So, full disclosure, I'm not sure that it does, but I will tell you the title. The title is Money and Meaning, What I've Learned from Advising the Very Wealthy. And there's 3 sections to it. The first is managing wealth. The second is managing money. And the third is managing transitions. In managing wealth, there's lots of different components that most of your listeners will be familiar with. And I go through essentially what I think are a handful of topics that are important to know about how to think about things, how to define what's enough for you, how to budget and save, how to identify a wealth advisor, how to identify and assemble a team of advisors, how to get great service, how to be a good client, how to prepare your estate and the activities and the documents and what have you so that you don't leave a quagmire for other people. So that's sort of the wealth management topic. Managing money, I talk about some of the basics of managing money, and that you don't have to do more or beat an index every time, and how to have the proper framework to make sure that money becomes a tool, not a master for most people. And then in the managing transitions, I chose a handful of topics that represent when we have transitions in our lives, and things that people don't necessarily talk about. So one is, there's one, how do you inform and then involve and then entrust the next generation of young adults and adult children into the family finances so that you educate and involve and ultimately prepare them to be the stewards that they will become when some, most, or all that wealth gets passed down. I talk about the first part is I talk about the sacred art of listening. And I think that's a topic that not many people really spend a lot of time on. But in order to, I think, do all of the things well, most importantly, to have a cohesive family, is to be able to understand how to listen and listen deeply, and not just listening to respond, but listening to be involved in what the speaker is actually saying and feeling. And then I sort of finish up, I talk about prenuptial agreements, which is sort of a difficult conversation for most people, and then managing transitions when the aging parents, say in their 80s or whatever, 90s, what to do to help them manage the transition of their lives with thoughtfulness and dignity. So I would say that, there's a million books out there on managing wealth and managing money, and mine's going to be the next one. But the only thing that really makes it different is that I wrote it, and I'm told that it's very conversational. So the way I speak is the way I write, and the way I write is the way I think. And so maybe this will be just presented in a way in which it's received well.
I love that. And I know I've been privileged to get a preview of the table of contents and some of the writing. And so I know there are chapters in there that I've, despite having read a number of these books, not seen in any other books. One is the sacred art of listening. And so maybe we could double click there for a minute. And a good place to start might be, why is it the sacred art of listening? I think there's been plenty of words on the art of listening and active listening, but the sacred art is a different take. So tell us about that.
Well, I think as a professional salesperson, I was a great talker. And still today, as you can tell, I talk frequently and quickly. And occasionally when someone's inhaling, I fill that gap and talk when they should be talking. But what I learned probably about 10 years ago from someone who was studying how to be a chaplain at a hospital, I learned about how to listen with your whole body and your mind. And I learned from audio tape from Thomas Keating, The Contemplative Journey, about the difficulty of freeing your mind from thought so that you can actually deeply listen, absorb, and validate the speaker. And in so doing, it is such a powerful communication by listening to someone deeply and not interrupting. And while they're speaking, let silence sit there so that the person can then say what they meant to say but didn't want to say or were afraid to say. And it's the sacred art of listening is just something that so few people do, myself included. Every once in a while, I catch myself in the act of being a good listener, but it is rare. And I do highlight it because it's so valuable. It's an act of generosity. It's a validating thing that I think is underappreciated. So obviously, it's something that's important to me. I don't think I do it well enough, but I think what's more important is recognizing that it needs to be done. And if you know it's there, you work on it. Thanks for asking.
I love that. I love the idea of freeing your mind from thoughts so you can actually listen, of letting silence sit there. I'm thinking now of times when I've been on the receiving end of that. And you're right. When you think about it that way, it's so rare that I am speaking with someone and I feel that their purpose in listening is to actually let me say whatever I'm trying to express. There's all these things we develop of, I've got to speak fast enough that they don't interrupt me. I've got to keep the logic chain tight so they don't get bored. I've got, all this stuff. And when you put it that way, it's, man, what a lost art. I think we're all after some version of trying to pursue truth. And if we are, that includes deeply understanding the people we serve and the people we're in community with. And that's beautifully put. I'm going to be thinking about that for a while. On a practical note, are there any kind of nudges? I mean, given that, I think we agree this is probably a lost art, are there any nudges or habits or things you've developed to try to kind of just nudge yourself, towards that sacred art of listening in your day-to-day practice?
Well, I learned, 20 some odd years ago from my boss by observing how well, he was the guy that everybody liked. Everybody liked. And he was, he wasn't just George Clooney, good looking and all that sort of charismatic stuff. He was just this guy everybody liked. And mostly it was because he was such a good listener. And I watched him meeting after meeting where he would look at the person deeply. He'd smile. They would say something and he'd say, "Tell me a little bit more." And they would. And then he would listen and he would say, "Wow, tell me a little bit more." And he wasn't doing it tactically like a politician would do it to win votes. He was doing it genuinely because he was genuinely interested in the people and everything they're saying. But the one thing that I will offer to anybody is this, very complicated, sophisticated phrase, "Tell me a little bit more." And if you can incorporate that in your vocabulary and dialogue, you will become a fabulous conversationalist.
I love that. It reminds me of the line, I forget who said this, but try to be interested more so than interesting. And I've thought a lot about that. I think it's easy to remember the people who actually were interested in you. Because
there's so few.
I think there's
John, there's so few.
Yeah. Very much. Very much. And it may be in this domain, but I'm curious about some of I know there are many things in the book that are surprising, in a good way. What what's something that either, kind of surprised you as you worked it in there, or maybe might come off as surprising to some of the readers?
Well, as they say, I tell the truth, my truth, right? Whatever that is. But I think what might be a little surprise is how I express the fact that I don't think all of the practices in the investment business are as good as they could be. Mm. And I don't know if it was one of the baseball guys who says, I call some like I see some, but I don't think that the asset allocation models generally are that good. There's, I think, tragic flaws in there that are disclaimed away in the 11-page disclosure at the bottom, which, basically is a defense in the lawsuit if somebody ever sued why this didn't make any sense, didn't make any money. I think some of the products that are used are, it's legal, but I don't know who the heck it's appropriate for. I think some of the practices that are common today are not that great, although they are very common. And I think they're executed by well-intentioned people who were only trained one way to do business and therefore truly believe it to be the right way. I am leery of many of the illiquid products that are represented to be highly likely to accomplish whatever the past returns were based upon hypotheticals or, rates of return with indexes that have enormous survivor bias in it. I know I'm getting into the jargon element, and I apologize, but the point is, what are the surprises? I'm not thrilled with everything about the investment industry, and I know that won't make me popular with a lot of, my peers or former peers, but I believe everything I say is true, and I think I have a lot of facts and evidence, even though it's sort of not always flattering. So maybe the surprise for the reader is if you read this, you'll at least know that there's a reason to ask another question in some of these situations. So hopefully there'll be a social good that'll come out of it. And the other thing is there's so many good financial advisors out there who do things really well, above board, with high integrity, and deliver good products and services. I want all of your listeners, John, to find those advisors.
I love that. One of my favorite things about you from day one when we met is, and it comes across clearly there, is you have this discontent with the subpar, or to borrow some jargon, you're after quality as you see it, and you're willing to go to war for it. And that's wonderful. I can't imagine, I think our species will be better, the more people can be in that fight. And so that's wonderful. What is your next frontier? So I know the book is going to come out at some point, and I know you're building an advisory practice. But I also know you to be someone who, you're poking at quality on many fronts. So what's the next frontier for you?
Thanks for asking. I think there's two things that I really need to do. It's first and foremost. The first is to maintain a really high level of quality and satisfaction with clients. We do an annual survey where we ask a number of questions. What are we doing well? How can we improve? Most importantly, we ask, how would you rate the quality of your interaction with us? And we'd like to have 100%. That's our goal. So the first thing is to keep client satisfaction high. The second thing, obviously, is to deliver on investment results. And so we are paramount there. As far as, the other things that I do during the day, I do think that I'll probably write another book, and this one will be shorter, but it'll be how to manage money. And it will be a little bit deeper into some of the nuts and bolts and some of the things that, I've done over the years. Not that I think I have mastered it or that I'm Peter Lynch or Warren Buffett or any of these other people, but in a way in which it's accessible. But most of all, I want to keep evolving and have fun. And if there's a need, be able to spend some time to fill.
Yeah, I love it. I look forward to, I always enjoy reading your writing. And for our listeners, some of that is on Chris's website, which we can link to. But I'm glad to know there will be more. One of the things we always ask on the show is what help are you looking for? And that's an intentionally broad question. And then however you answer that, if you can include, where people can find you, if they could be helpful, that would be great.
John, the help that I need, among other things, is to understand the counterpoint. So one, Charlie Munger and Vert, I really do spend a fair amount of time trying to understand where I might have misunderstood a situation. So I'm always more than willing, and I engage with clients and they help me think about things differently. So, that would be helpful. And if I'm out here pitching, if there are people that actually get the book down the road, a review, good or bad, and quite frankly, I'm not afraid of bad reviews, but a review would be most helpful. But, perhaps the whole thing is to wake up every day and be grateful for where we are, what we have, and our opportunity to live in, a free enterprise system where as bad as things might be, it's still better than most other places in the world. And go out and contribute to your community. And if you have enough resources, society, and if you don't have enough money for the Girl Scouts, then just make sure your family's happy. So that's what people can do.
Absolutely. That's wonderful. That's well put. So our standard closing question for everyone is, since we're after quality with a capital Q, what is your most memorable encounter with capital Q quality?
I probably have to say that the effort that Warren Buffett, Berkshire Hathaway, and Charlie Munger have put forward over the last 60 years to, not only make money, which of course they have, and they're very commercial, but to educate and help people. And I have been one of those guys who would wake up early on Saturday morning when the, annual report and the management letter would be released, typically in February, to read the letter. And I've printed them all out. I've got them in binders. Of course, all the past videos are, on Yahoo and YouTube and what have you. But I think, when you talk about sustainable quality and an effort to do the right thing by educating people, I think what I've personally learned from these management letters and these videos and the occasional newspaper editorial, I think the Berkshire Hathaway annual meetings and everything that they do, both Munger as well as Buffett, certainly from an investment perspective in our lifetimes, that's right at the top.
Yeah, I count myself an enormous beneficiary of that as well, and have much gratitude towards it. So that's well put. Well, Chris, this has been fun. Thank you again for sharing your wisdom with us. Glad we could have you on the show, and we'll leave it there. Thank you again.
John, real pleasure. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you for listening. For more resources, please visit our website, theartofquality.co. If you know someone who would be a good fit for this format, please reach out.